tea. Today we are having a conversation on some economics, and this economics, especially on with regards to vaccine. One of the big questions have been, and we talked about it in an earlier episode, how were vaccines developed so fast? And a large component to that was the financial aspect. So today I have the privilege of talking to a dear colleague of mine who I worked with in my past life. His name is Tom, and I'll get him to introduce him, and then we'll go from there. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself a bit?
You bet. So my name is Tom Taylor, and I'm an economist. I teach part-time at Eastern Michigan University. And prior to that, I was working in a variety of different places, but I spent a number of years working in the pharmaceutical industry for Pfizer, among other places. And some of the work, while I wasn't working on vaccines at the time, we were working on treatments for viral infections such as the common cold, focusing less on coronavirus, but more on rhinovirus. But I also did some work for a group called Research Triangle Institute, modeling out the effects of pneumococcal vaccines. So I've had a little bit of experience in this area, but nothing like what's happened with the pandemic.
So talking about vaccines and vaccine developments, lot of finance go into that. So if you want to just introduce a little bit on, how does federal fundings work for vaccines, the development, the manufacturing, and the distribution, and what are the contributing factors of that to vaccine development, Tom?
Sure. So I think in general, it's much more of a public-private partnership than you see typically with synthesized drugs. The typical pill that you get in a pharmacy, that's pretty much taken care of by the pharmaceutical manufacturer, all the financing, and then the real financing comes from the insurance companies and the individuals who pay for those drugs. And a lot of the financing for the development of vaccines also comes from the people who pay for them, but a lot comes from the NIH, comes from private philanthropic organizations, some of which that have evolved in recent years with funding from the Gates Foundation and other foundations. Some comes from World Bank. It's really kind of an interesting world, the whole vaccine development world. Even the companies are different. I've worked with people at GSK and some other manufacturers on the vaccine side. It's different than when you work with people in the synthesized drug world, which is that's a different environment, and partly because of the biotech and there's so much of an emphasis on the science behind everything. But anyway, a lot of it comes historically from the federal government. The federal government also provides funding through Medicare and Medicaid for the purchase of the vaccines. And they have a variety of different rules, and typically through Medicare and Medicaid, there's no there's no out-of-pocket cost for most of the vaccines, not all, but many of the vaccines. And probably somewhere around 60+%, if not more, of all vaccines are ultimately paid through the federal government, either Medicare or Medicaid. We also have some very targeted programs for people who fall through the cracks, children who aren't covered by Medicaid, the uninsured. There are special programs where the federal government actually buys directly from manufacturers and then distributes to the states, and the states in turn distribute that. So it's a very complicated world in terms of the financing historically. And we've had trouble so that we've had to have special rules put in place to indemnify manufacturers to make sure there is sufficient manufacturing taking place.
Katie, you have a question?
Sure. You addressed in many respects, and I apologize for the chatter behind me, the larger picture. Can you speak to how economics and the finances of development of specifically the COVID vaccine may have been different than others, or the process hastened?
Right, and so that's the next question is so how's it different? And the biggest thing I would say is that really it's the science has changed to speed things up. But secondly, the federal government through Operation Warp Speed and the CARES Act has really put together a considerable funding. Last count I had $14 to $17 billion to help support, not so much development, but for supporting manufacturing. And that's a huge thing because it guarantees that when companies develop, there'll be funding there to pay for those vaccines. And in particular, in the case of Moderna, it's not just paying for manufacturing, but the NIH and Moderna, they have been working hand in hand. They've worked hand in hand on prior vaccines. So it's that government NIH slash small biotech startup type company interaction that has really developed, changed the way in which vaccines are developed, from taking a minimum of 4 years to, I mean, the NIH Moderna vaccine was developed in 2 days, at least on computer. It took a month to get it into clinical supplies, which is unheard of. It took 2 months to get it into the arms of people for the first clinical trials. So that's just phenomenal. And a lot of that's science, but it's also, everybody's known that this is coming one time or another. So there's been a lot of work, particularly thanks to the NIH. They have made sure that companies like Moderna were being funded to develop these, what they call platforms, so that when the time came, if we were lucky and we had a platform designed for, say, coronavirus, we'd be able to put it to effect right away. And they did. The MERS vaccine that was under development was a coronavirus type of vaccine. And so they simply took what they learned from that, funding from the federal government, put it together, and then companies like Pfizer partnered with other biotech companies, in this case, a German biotech company. And when they did that, you know, they didn't have enough wherewithal to actually produce the vaccine and then in turn distribute it. They partnered with Pfizer, which they partner with on others. So what's new, I think, is that federal government funding for making sure that companies that produce these vaccines at risk would receive payment for those vaccines.
And could you just elaborate for people that find it hard to understand, you know, how just that was able to speed up the process of a vaccine coming out? Because otherwise it's up to the companies themselves to try to acquire that funds or be at risk to produce something without being able to pay that. So
right, and there's two components to that. One is that you need the funding, and so a small company like Moderna is never going to have the money to be able to do the clinical trials. Right, the clinical trial takes 30, 40,000 people because you're doing it in a large population, and they're paying them a minimum, the participants, of $1,000 a piece. So we're talking about $30 million or so just for the participants, and they're paying the facilities even more than that. So, I mean, it's taking hundreds of millions of dollars to just get it so that you could submit it. But if you submit it and haven't produced anything, it's going to take months, if not a year, to get production up to the point. So that funding was crucial for speeding up the development process, and particularly because of those trials have to be so big for vaccines. And secondly, for doing the manufacturing before you actually know you have a drug or a vaccine. And once they did that, the vaccines were ready to go the day they received. I mean, the FDA approval was on one day and the vaccine was in arms the next day or 2 days later. It wasn't perfect. Pfizer struggled to get some of its production up to speed, but they had a lot already ready to go. They had production waiting in the warehouses here in Kalamazoo, just waiting to know who to send it to. And so they're gearing up as fast as they can. And these compounds, because of the science, my understanding is that they're somewhat easier to scale up in some cases than the original type of vaccines that were based on inactivated viruses and things like that. It's still not easy, and things can go awry, but they're doing a great job compared to what has happened in the past. And the fact that the federal funding was there for it, I think, made a big difference. Does that help explain that?
Oh, definitely. And in that vein, if you could also take it to the next level and touch a little bit on, yes, it's one thing to manufacture and have those ready, but what are some of these federal incentives to get these to the people and get the people to take it? So can you touch a bit on that?
Yeah, well, I think that's where we've broken down a little bit. So we've done a great job working with these companies to get the vaccines developed. We've done a great job getting them to produce it. The next thing is it's no good unless it's in someone's arm. And distributing it then becomes a major challenge. And that's where we've run into some trouble. For one thing, the financing for the states, which are the decision was to make sure that the states would be the center for the distribution, and that reflects in part our history of having public health, being directed at the federal level but administered at the state level. The states have had budget cuts over the years, and as a result, haven't had as much funding. They haven't been doing as much contact tracing as people had hoped, and so they didn't have as much funding to get these clinics up and running as they had years ago. My wife in 1977 was part of the original swine flu clinic. She went around to the state of Iowa, and she must have vaccinated 40 or 50,000 people. And they had a process in place, but it takes a while to get that ramped up, and that was funded. Well, we haven't had the same kind of level of funding, and so it's been more difficult. There's been technical challenges because of the super extreme cold conditions that the Pfizer vaccine has to be kept at, and even the Moderna has to be heavily refrigerated, more so than normal. So there's technical challenge, but I think the biggest issue is that we've depleted our public health infrastructure to a large extent. And the other venues that we've used, which would make pretty good sense, CVS and Walgreens, they're only now being ramped up, and I don't fully understand why it's taken so long to get them engaged. I mean, when pharmacists started doing vaccinations years ago, not too long ago, 10, 15 years ago, it increased the overall rate of vaccination in the United States for the flu. We have the people in place. They go into nursing homes. That's what they do. And we've been a little slow on that. The other thing, and this is, I think, an important point, is people are saying no. And that's a tough nut to crack. I mean, I'm shocked at the number of medical professionals who have said no to the vaccine. In some hospital systems, 40% have been vaccinated, 60% have been vaccinated, and 40% have chosen not to. If you can't convince the health professionals to get the vaccine, it's going to be a whole lot harder to convince the general public. So there's a series of things that people are doing. Employers are providing incentives. A number of employers are offering 4 hours of pay plus transportation costs to get people to take the vaccine. Health plans, hospital systems are doing the same kind of thing, saying that you can have a bonus for all of the extra work you're doing because of COVID, but only if you take the vaccine now. And there's states that are toying with ideas of, well, how do we incentivize providers and others to make sure that the most at-risk populations get vaccinated? And so they're working with pay-to-play type plans. And they've done this, as you know, often to set up some kind of pay-for-performance type of system to encourage outcomes that are desirable. And so that's one of the easy things they can do, is they can provide that to encourage vaccination rates. But it's a tough nut to crack.
No question. You're addressing the specific things that are happening economically for COVID. What about in the broader spectrum, the COVID affecting the economics of healthcare in general? Yeah,
so that's an interesting one. I think there's a lot of things going on, and I'm just going to give you my opinions on that. I think that COVID, first and foremost, COVID has been a pressure test, and it has exposed where we have strengths, and unfortunately has exposed some terrible weaknesses. They're not new. We knew about these, but they're just clearer now, I guess. And one of those are the disparities. COVID has ravaged a population that is not like me, who can work from home or is retired. It's a population that has fewer choices and fewer options and less access to medical care. And as a result, the vulnerable populations in the United States have really taken it on the chin with this. So if you talk about future changes, that would be one area where we really should be thinking about how we can do a better job, including on an economic standpoint, by getting targeted relief to people. Why did I get a check? I didn't do anything for this except stay home. Oh, good on me for doing that, but I didn't lose any money because of it. I shouldn't have gotten a check. Those checks should then send bigger checks to people who really need them, or to set up some kind of system like we have for flood insurance. right? If regular insurance isn't going to cover a catastrophe like this, then we should have federal government step in and provide funding to those people who are most directly impacted. And there's so many things that have been exposed by this. It's just unfortunate. We know so much that we can develop a vaccine in 2 days. But we have no clue why people are not getting the vaccine. Why is that? I mean, it's not like this is new, and we can ask people questions, but then let's figure out how to impose systems that will ensure that more people get the vaccine. If it's important, as it is for herd immunity, get people vaccinated. So I guess my criticism is that our science is great when we can do randomized controlled trials because we trust those. We're not doing as much on the other side of things. Maybe we can't do the randomized controlled trials, but we need to understand human behavior to understand why people are doing what they're doing a little better. Now I don't know if that's really getting at the question you're asking, but I didn't understand why there's questions about, well, will people really adhere to the governor's request or order to stay home? Well, we didn't have a clue. I mean, yeah, this is the first time through, but we should understand things a little better than we do and than we have.
Thank you so much, Tom. This was very helpful to understand and kind of get a clearer picture. And I think that's what has been hard, not really understanding that clear picture. And, thank you for taking the time. I think you shared a lot of insight that made a lot of sense and taught us a lot from the financial and economic side that, helps add to that big picture. So thank you for taking the time, Tom. Thank you for joining on another episode. Hopefully this was very helpful. Please subscribe and, hope to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.